Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a Cast from Exile commander deck with Prosper Tome Bound as its general. Prosper Tome Bound is the front-facing commander option from the Planar Portal pre-constructed EDH deck from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Prosper is a 1/4 legendary Tiefling Warlock with Death Touch for 2 and Rakdos colors. At the beginning of our end step, we exile the top card of our library. Until the end of our next turn, we may play that card. Notice the text here. It says that we may play that card. Whenever we play a card from exile, we create a treasure token. Notice the text here. It says whenever we play a card from exile. This is important because if we were to exile a land, we can play that land from exile with Prosper and also create a treasure token for doing so. Playing cards from exile expands our resources by extending our card options. This exiled card is not replacing the card drawn on our turn. It's giving us another option. That will be the name of our game in constructing the core of this build. We want to get cards into exile and benefit from peripheral effects by casting them, such as the treasure tokens created by Prosper. This influx of additional resources will allow us to out-tempo and out-resource our opponents on the path to imminent victory. We begin the core of this build with additional exiling options. These spells allow us to play the exiled cards until the end of our next turn. Through its spectacle cost, we can cast Light Up the Stage for just 1 red mana and exile the top 2 cards from our library. We can do the same when Atsushi the Blazing Sky dies, or we can choose to create 3 treasure tokens instead. Ignite the Future exiles the top 3 cards of our library, and if we cast this spell for its flashback cost, then we may play the exile cards this way without paying their mana costs. Commune with Lava continues this theme by exiling the top X cards of our library at instant speed, and until the end of our next turn, we may play those cards. Apex of Power gives us until the end of our turn to play the exiled cards. It exiles the top 7 cards of our library, and if we cast this spell from our hand, we add 10 mana of any one color. With Prosper on our side of the battlefield, the treasure tokens could rain down on us like a refreshing spring shower. For the purposes of establishing repeatable exile effects, we include cards that trigger at the beginning of our upkeep. If we choose Cons when it enters the battlefield, then Outpost Siege exiles the top card of our library, and we may play that card this turn. Visions of Phyrexia does the same, except if we don't play the card, then we create a tapped Power Stone artifact token. Theater of Horrors has no deadline for playing its exile cards, but we can only play cards exiled by it during our turn, and only if an opponent loses life this turn. If needed, we can activate Theater of Horror's damage-dealing ability in order to meet this condition. Urabrask Heretic Praetor follows suit, but also has a punishing effect for our opponents. At the beginning of their upkeep, the next time they would draw a card this turn, instead they exile the top card of their library. They may play it this turn. If an opponent is unable to play the card, then that card is lost in exile. As this build is focused on maximizing our resources, any cards that deny our opponents their own resources widens the chasm-like gap between us and them even further. For additional repeatable exile effects, we can use Chandra Torch of Defiance's +1 ability. It exiles the top card of our library, and if we don't cast it, Chandra deals 2 damage to each opponent. If a player would draw a card, instead, Ubamask exiles the top card of that player's library instead. Each player may play lands and cast spells from cards exiled by Ubamask this turn. Any card a player doesn't play by the end of the turn is lost in exile. Ubamask could potentially hurt us, but we're playing Rakdos here. We're okay with a little self-inflicted pain. Brazen Cannonade's exile effect is triggered at the beginning of our post-combat main phase. If we attacked with a creature this turn, we exile the top card of our library, and we have until the end of combat on our next turn to play this card. Speaking of combat, let's add some attack and combat damage triggers in order to diversify our exiling effects. Lelia, the Blade Reforged, exiles the top card of our library, and we may play that card this turn. She also gets a +1/+1 counter whenever one or more cards are exiled from our library or from our graveyard. Whenever Tectonic Giant attacks or is the target of a spell an opponent controls, it either deals 3 damage to each opponent or we exile the top 2 cards of our library. We choose one of those cards, and until the end of our next turn, we may play that card. Itali, Primal Storm, exiles the top card of each player's library, and we may cast any number of spells from among these cards without paying their mana costs. Imagine if Prosper is on our side of the battlefield when Itali attacks. Professional Facebreaker creates a treasure token whenever one or more creatures we control deals combat damage to a player. As a bonus, we could sacrifice a treasure token to exile the top card of our library, and we may play that card this turn. Whenever Dream Pillager deals combat damage to a player, we exile that many cards from the top of our library. Until end of turn, we may cast spells from among those exiled cards. Diversifying our exile effects even further, we have Valakut Exploration. Through its landfall ability, we exile the top card of our library, and we may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. At the beginning of our end step, we put all cards exiled by Valakut Exploration into our graveyard, and then deal that much damage to each opponent. Whenever we cast a spell, Burgi, God of Storytelling, adds 1 mana to our mana pool. Until end of turn, we don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Chaining together this red mana with the treasure tokens created by Prosper could lead to some very explosive turns. The flip side of Burgi is also valuable. Harnfell, Horn of Bounty, is a legendary artifact that lets us discard a card in order to exile the top 2 cards of our library. We may play those cards this turn. Pitching unneeded or unwanted cards from our hand in order to activate Harnfell's exile effect provides us with a potential win condition. Now let's focus on our opponent's libraries instead. You Find Some Prisoners exiles the top 3 cards of an opponent's library. Until the end of our next turn, we may play one of those cards and spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. Wand of Wonder lets us cast between 1 and 3 instant and or sorcery cards without paying their mana costs. Cunning Rhetoric exiles the top card of an opponent's library whenever that player attacks us or a planeswalker we control with 1 or more creatures. We may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. We do the same thing with Stolen Strategy, except the top card of each opponent's library is exiled at the beginning of our upkeep instead. Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor's activated ability, lets us pay 4 and 3 black mana and discard X cards in order to exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. We may play lands and cast spells from among these cards without paying their mana costs. This effect pairs beautifully with Brainstealer Dragon. At the beginning of our end step, we exile the top card of each opponent's library. We may play those cards for as long as they remained exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. Whenever a permanent an opponent owns enters the battlefield under our control, they lose life equal to its mana value. Brainstealer Dragon's life loss ability can be triggered by spells cast through Gix's ability. The same can be said for the Ruinous Powers. At the beginning of our upkeep, we choose an opponent at random and exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, we may play that card and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. If we cast a spell this way, then its owner loses life equal to its mana value. When paired with Brainstealer Dragon's ability, the life lost is doubled. Players' hands are potential targets for exile effects as well. Dream Devourer gives each non-land card in our hand foretell, and when we foretell a card, we pay 2 mana during our turn and exile it from our hand face down. We may cast it on a later turn for its foretell cost, which, for cards foretold by Dream Devourer, is equal to that card's mana cost reduced by 2 mana. Fiend of the Shadows exiles a card from an opponent's hand whenever it deals combat damage to that player, and we may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Prosper approves. We have installed numerous exile effects into the core of this build so far. Now, it's time to include some other cards with casting from exile benefits in order to pair alongside Prosper. Whenever we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand, Keeper of Secrets deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to target opponent. Passionate Archaeologist mimics this damage-dealing effect by stapling it onto Prosper. The first spell we cast from exile has Cascade if Wild Magic Sorcerer is on our side of the battlefield. Nalfeshni copies spells we cast from exile, and if a permanent spell is copied this way, then the token gains haste, and at the beginning of the end step, we sacrifice it. With cards upon cards inundating exile zones all over the place, now it's time to gain additional value from Prosper's treasure token producing ability. Let's triple up the artifact tokens we create by including Academy Manufactor. Whenever we create a treasure token, we also create a food and a clue token. Peripheral life gain and card draw effects are welcomed features in just about any deck, and this is especially true in a Rakdos build. Whenever we create a treasure token, Zorn creates an additional one. Whenever Goldspan Dragon attacks or becomes the target of a spell, we create a treasure token, and treasures we have can be tapped and sacrificed to provide 2 mana of any one color instead of just 1. Inspiring Statuary gives non-artifact spells we control Improvise, which means we can tap our treasures for colorless mana to cast these spells. This extends the life of our treasures and makes them even more versatile. When Reign of Riches enters the battlefield, we create 2 treasure tokens, and the first spell we cast each turn that mana from our treasure token was spent to cast it has Cascade. For each mana spent from a treasure token to cast it, Kalain, Reclusive Painter, puts a +1/+1 counter on other creatures we control when they enter the battlefield. She also creates a treasure token when she comes into play. We can create treasure tokens in troves with Ancient Copper Dragon. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we roll our lucky d20, and then we create a number of treasure tokens equal to the result. Creating an average of 10 treasure tokens per roll is a very powerful way to out-resource and overwhelm our opponents. Imagine if the Reaver Cleaver were attached to Ancient Copper Dragon. In this scenario, the number of treasure tokens we could create is anywhere from 7 to 27. Since the Reaver Cleaver also provides trample to the equipped creature, we should be able to hit for combat damage and continue filling our coffers with those shiny treasure tokens. Now that the core of this build has been filled with various exile effects, ways to benefit from them, as well as some treasure token synergies, let's wrap up this video by including some other cards that synergize with and enhance our theme. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under our control, both Reckless Fireweaver and Ingenious Artillerist deals 1 damage to each opponent. These cards can be considered win conditions in this type of build. Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target whenever a player sacrifices a permanent. Remember, tokens are permanents too, so whenever we tap and sacrifice treasures to cast our spells or activate abilities, Mayhem Devil triggers. Alternate win conditions provide more balance and longevity for any deck, and this build is no different. Agent of the Iron Throne staples onto Prosper the ability to have each opponent lose 1 life whenever a creature or artifact we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Nadir's Nightblade drains each opponent for 1 life, and we gain 1 life whenever a token we control leaves the battlefield. Marionette Master has a similar ability. If we choose to put 3 +1/+1 counters on her when she comes into play through her Fabricate ability, then whenever an artifact we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. In this scenario, each time we sacrifice a treasure token, target opponent loses 4 life. For more straight up, you win the game options, Revel in Riches and Hellkite Tyrant will serve this build well. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, Revel in Riches creates a treasure token, and if we control at least 10 treasure tokens at the beginning of our upkeep, we win the game. This feat seems inordinately easy to achieve when considering how we have built the core of this deck. Hellkite Tyrant's game-winning effect is similar, but instead of 10 or more treasures, we need at least 20 artifacts. Its combat damage trigger of pilfering all artifacts an opponent controls can speed up this game-winning process. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a Cast from Exile commander deck around Prosper Tome Bound as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for creating an engine of exiling cards, casting them from exile, and creating treasure tokens, in addition to providing ways to optimize and benefit from this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.